I don't know what's worse, being executed or spending the rest of your life in prison. I'm just sitting in limbo right now. There is no hope once you're in here. When you're guilty, accept it. If you ever thought about taking somebody's life, you better think about it long and hard, because to walk that road right there it's a lot of heartache. You may think you're tough, but really ain't nothing. If you're a murderer, you're nothing.
This is US 69 northbound out of Lufkin, right up on the north fringe of Angelina County. "32 years ago, almost to the minute. It's about 5 minutes after 8. I was headed this direction in a big hurry to the crime scene up here. Calls of this nature, that adrenaline kicks in, and you don't need the morning cup of coffee. You don't ask questions, you just jump in the car and you respond. All hands on deck. Coming into the edge of the little town of Wells. It's like so many little towns in East Texas. Population well under 1,000 at that time. Everyone knows everyone. Weather is almost identical to that morning. Fall weather, hunting season.
We moved around a lot when I was young. Texas, Chicago. Mom, dad, stepdads. No solid family unit. A lot of disruption. I wasn't given much attention. I was given free rein, so I became a wild child. I just had I didn't care attitude. I felt like nobody cared about me, so why should I? So I'm just gonna do as I please. And that's basically the way I lived my life. Name's David Lewis, 52 years old. Been here over just a little 30 years. I was kicked out of the house at 16 and I was living on the streets, and the only way to provide for myself was to become a thief, because nobody wanted to hire an uneducated 16-year-old boy, didn't have any skills. So I stole, just took what I wanted. I believe I was 20 or 21 when I moved to Lufkin. It's a small country town. I used to drink, I was an alcoholic, and I smoked weed, took acid, pills, mushrooms, whatever got me off. But yeah, once I tasted the marijuana, that was it for me. I was in love. Helped me escape reality of life and put me in another world, in another state of mind where I could escape all this. And then when I got older, it turned more into alcohol. And once I became a drunk, I just didn't care about nothing. And I'm going to do whatever I wanted and didn't care about the consequences. Me and my friends would be out late at night drinking and smoking, and we'd just decide to go burglarize something. It's, you know what young boys did back then. Houses, stores, whatever we could get into. Living on the streets, you know, gotta do what you can do to survive. That day, me and some friends, we went down to the liquor store, bought some beer, and we decided to go fishing. And while out fishing, I found some mushrooms, and I ate the mushrooms, drank beer, and by the end of the day, I was pretty plastered. So they dropped me off at my grandpa's in Lufkin, and I'm sitting there waiting on him because we were gonna go hunting that night, and it's taking him a long time to show up. And so when it gets dark, I get the gun and I'm gonna go hunting by myself. I was crossing behind Miss Ruby's house, and I was planning to cut through the backyard and go down to a stream behind her house, because that's usually where the deer and stuff hang out at nighttime. When I'm walking by, I see the bathroom windows open, and I don't see no car nowhere. So I crawl into the bathroom window. I stand at the door that goes into the hallway. The hallway goes two ways. The left goes to the kitchen, and then the right goes to a couple of bedrooms. So I go into that bedroom, and that's where a gun rack is. So I take the guns and I roll them up in a bed sheet. As I'm coming out, somebody's coming through a hall door from the living room. I see the silhouette. I just raise the gun and pow. She kind of turned towards me and let out a loud scream, and I struck her in the top of the head with the barrel of the gun. Then I flicked the light on and seen who it was. I'm like, man. I thought the house was empty. I didn't think anybody was in there. I was kind of shocked. I didn't even think. I took the keys to the car and the guns and left. I left the car parked on the side of the highway. I'm sitting in my grandpa's trailer, smoking a cigarette, drink coffee, getting ready to leave when the police come across the highway. I knew right then that they were coming for me, that they'd found Miss Ruby already. It rained earlier in the day, and I left footprints through the trail in the woods right up to my grandpa's trailer house. My grandpa's girlfriend opens the door, and one of the investigators, as soon as he sees me, he tells the two police that's with him, "I think we got our man." They take me to the police station asking questions, and I just keep denying it. But as soon as they tried to implicate my grandfather in it, that's when I finally confessed. Told him I did it, that he had nothing to do with it. Well, I figured I'd be in prison a long time, 30, 40 years maybe, but when I got my attorney and he told me they were seeking a death penalty, I'm like, what? Death penalty? What is that? And he told me what it was, and I'm like, oh. Yeah, I really didn't think about death penalty when I was free. I didn't even know we had one. I shut down all thought about the crime until I was sitting in a cell and started thinking about what I'd done and what I'm fixing to face, and that's when I broke down. When I came to death row, I just kept it locked out, and I didn't really face what I'd done until 2004, and that's when it really hit me hard. That's when I went ahead and accepted the responsibility for it. You know, whatever comes, I accept it. Either life in prison or the execution, either one I accept. What can you do when you're guilty, man? You don't have a hope or a prayer when you're guilty.
This is the evidence box of the David Lee Lewis trial back in '86. I haven't seen most of this stuff since that day. These are the glasses that Ms. Ruby had on when she walked into her home that night. Right lens is missing, right ear, leg missing. She still had these partially on her face when I arrived at the scene, and a round was fired. Went through right about here. Struck her in the corner of the eye. You have to quite often kind of divorce yourself from the physical aspects of a scene like that, if you can, and you try to do the job and document everything and get everything ready. Of course, you're always thinking ahead to the trial part of this situation anytime you're in that type of situation. And then you think about it later. We got our big break, I think, initially when we found the footprints. Casting of a shoe print. This is a pretty good casting. Heel, toe, tread. Especially when you can mate it up with the actual shoe that made it. This was found at the rear of the home, not far from where He gained entry. And then things fell into place. When we approached the residence where Lewis was apprehended, that's where they found the shoes that matched the prints. Sometimes it's nice to be lucky. Not quite as good as a fingerprint, but very, very strong circumstantial evidence. You know, a thief is a thief is a thief. Not to get biblical, but I'm sure somewhere in that list of 10, I still recall from way back that there's one in there about stealing and thou shalt not. You go in with the intent to do just a property felony, and something goes horribly wrong and somebody dies, and it leaps all the way up through all the various steps of different levels of crime right to the very top, the one that we hold most heinous, which is capital murder. Did he go there with the intent to kill somebody? No. You're never going to be able to convince me or anybody else of that. Did somebody die as a result of him being somewhere where he wasn't supposed to be? Yes, they did. And an innocent person lost their life. And you look at it, we've got 30-something years of back and forth, lives torn apart, lives on the inside, lives on the outside, and it fits on this one table.
In David's particular case, the evidence of guilt was overwhelming. They had confessions and they found evidence from the burglary and the place where he was living. The prosecution put on evidence that David Lewis knew and understood what he was doing at the time the offense was committed. I'm John Anderson. I was born and raised in Lufkin, Texas. I've practiced law here for about 34 years, and I was David Lewis's defense lawyer. A capital murder jury at the time this case was tried is asked specific questions in the punishment phase of the case. One of those questions is whether the defendant knowingly and intelligently committed the crime, and the other question is whether or not that defendant is going to be a future danger to society. Those are black and white questions the jury is asked to decide. The issue of mental competence and the defendant's ability to understand what it was he did, those are not black and white questions that are asked to a jury. When you have someone like Mr. Lewis who is mentally impaired, even if you read that defendant his rights, the question remains whether or not he understands his rights and he can make a knowing and intelligent decision to waive those rights and to give a statement. And so there was a strong argument to be made for the defense that he was not knowing enough and understanding enough to where he was making a voluntary confession. And so I'm asking the jury to consider and to believe the difficulty that David had from a mental standpoint, and to consider, based upon his lack of understanding in general, to answer the questions in such a way that he's given life in prison and not the death penalty.
My son was born in '65, and I had a very hard delivery. I was in labor for 72 hours. They had to forcibly remove him with forceps, which damaged his brain and his eyes. And me being so young and stupid, I didn't realize that until he started going to school. My name is Linda Lewis, and I'm David's mother. I was almost 18 when I had him. And this is David in school. He is a cute little booger. In the park playing with his ball. He used to chase that ball around. I can see him doing it now, just a little bitty thing, toddling around. Him and Linda, Christmas time. Oh yeah, here's Mommy's boy. He's my firstborn. He's my baby. Still is. I don't care how old he gets or what he does. He's always going to be my baby. And I'm always going to love him dearly. When he had homework to do, you couldn't make him understand. I mean, you could sit there and you could explain it, and show him, and explain it, and show him. And he just didn't grasp it. I knew that he was real shy and standoffish with other kids, but I don't think I actually really snapped to what was going on with him until I had him in a private school. About 3 months into it, they told me that they couldn't do anything for my son, and they wanted me to take him and have him tested, his mental capacity. And that's when I found out that he had problems. And there was nothing that I could do about it, except try to keep him out of trouble and try to teach him right from wrong. And I did a pretty good job of that, for the most part. All I know is that everybody thinks he's a monster, and he's not. He's a very loving, caring person.
David Lee Lewis was given the death penalty Tuesday night by a jury that earlier found him guilty of capital murder in the shooting death of Myrtle Ruby, 74, of Wells. Wow. That's been a long time ago. And he's still alive 30 years later. Yeah, that's what's unbelievable. My name is Rhonda Oakes. I'm the former journalist at the Lufkin Daily News. I did it for 20 plus years. I was born and raised in Lufkin, Texas. I'm proud to be a 7th generation Angelina County resident. It's always been a small community, very tight-knit community. People are very religious, and so you trust everyone. And, a crime like this, it brings it home that sometimes you can't trust everyone. The sheriff said Mrs. Ruby was killed by a single shot to the head from a .22 caliber rifle. Mrs. Ruby apparently was killed when she surprised a burglar upon returning home from church at about 9 p.m. We rarely saw crimes like this committed. It was a shocking event, so it drew a lot of interest. You know, you just wouldn't expect that sort of crime to occur. The jury was very serious and concentrated on the decision of whether or not he was mentally challenged. They knew he was guilty. They really listened to both sides of the events and tried to come back with an impartial decision. Looking back, I don't think he seemed that remorseful. In my mind, I think someone who's mentally challenged, they might be breaking into a house, they might be stealing some guns, and they might even hit the victim over the head with the gun, knock them out or whatever. But when you choose to shoot someone in the face, that's not a mentally challenged person will normally just run from the scene. He didn't. He chose not to. And he chose to take her life. And I think that put him into a class of criminals that was a type that we didn't see many of in East Texas. I think it was a cold-blooded act.
People like to think that the diagnosis of intellectual disabilities is something kind of like if you break your arm, you x-ray it, there's the break. What you've got is a broken arm. That's not how it works with mental retardation. It's a diagnosis in flux. It moves around. There's quite a bit of discrimination and myths and misunderstandings that get in the way, particularly in the field of criminal justice. I'm Dr. Richard Garnett. I've been involved in the field of disability since probably 1968. I was involved with David Lewis's case in 2006 when I was asked to come in and review his files and review all of the material they had from previous assessments and previous situations, schools and psychologists, etc. The material that was generated on him back then made it pretty clear that he had a diagnosis of mental retardation. Let's say you're testing somebody and you get a score, and the score is 70. Well, that's the cutoff. And if you're below that, you're retarded. But that's not how you do it. You look at that, and you look at all of this other material, and you look at the adaptive level that the person is, and you try and pull all of that together and see, does that support a diagnosis of mental retardation? And this part might not, and this part may. And this one you don't know, and this one sure doesn't. And so that's the battle in court, is to say, my testing came up with an IQ of 69. Prosecutor will come up and say, well, the state's done 3 or 4 different tests, and they always are in the 75 to 80 range, so it can't be. Well, that's because they're not given the right tests. They're not given them by the right people. They're not given them under the right circumstances. Mine were. And I think deep inside the system has these people already gone through the courts, convicted of capital murder, sentenced to death, and by God, we're going to do it. If the judge in the end had been convinced that David had intellectual disabilities, then I think the automatic response would be to vacate the death penalty and convert it to life in prison without parole. However, it was found that we had not proved our case. He's still there, so there must have been some appeals that were instituted, but they found that we did not present an adequate case to show that he had mental retardation.
If life without parole was the verdict and the sentence, then I think the family would probably be fine with it. If that's what the jury and the judge found to be the best solution for the crime. So I don't think any of us are out for just, this man's got to die. Justice has got to be done. My name is David Ruby. I'm a nephew of Myrtle Ruby. She grew up in the area. We all went to church together at the Falvey Methodist Church. At the time this happened to Aunt Myrtle, I had just moved back from St. Louis and just got a phone call from my mom. Someone had broke into Aunt Myrtle's house. She came home from church, and it was, of course, dark, and came into the house and evidently startled the person, and so they just shot her and murdered her. This still makes no sense whatsoever. Hey, Myrtle was a senior citizen. Why didn't the person just say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm going to walk out of your house? I mean, she's not going to beat him up. If they wanted to steal something, why didn't they just take it and leave? I know my cousins still suffer with that. How could they not? It devastated them, and it would devastate any child. No matter how old you are, it doesn't matter. It's your mom.
When I was born, my mom had trouble giving birth to me, and it gave me a mild retardation. That's why I'm a slow learner. In school, I just really didn't care about it.
My opinion on that is his mental capacity is not the issue. His threat to society is the issue. And whether he was a complete, lunatic or a sane person, to me, it's not an issue, because we want to remove people from society that are a threat to society. So, anyway, I don't buy it.
When they told me that Mr. Lewis was the suspect, I thought, why is this man still running the streets? David Lewis was known for burglary. He was also known for narcotic use, thefts. He had a history of criminal activity. My name is Sergeant Ruben Gonzalez, and I'm with the Oyster Creek Police Department. On September 1st, 1986, I received a call about the stabbing in the 1500 block of Avenue F. I remember it was a clear night that night. The stabbing occurred during a burglary of a vehicle. The complainant came out, observed the subject in between the cars, observed his wife's purse sitting in front of him with the car door open. And when the complainant yelled at the suspect stood up and stabbed him in the stomach. I parked right here at the same place. And the police officer was parked behind the vehicles, and the ambulance was right behind him. Hopefully there's not a dog. After I completed my initial investigation here at the house, I started going to the neighborhood, talking to different people, giving them a description and see if they had remembered anybody like that or anything. But that description matched so many people. Then approximately about 2 days later, I received a call from Mr. A.L. Thompson about the stabbing.
This is me and my two brothers and my sister. A.L., me, my sister, and Danny, my brother. You don't see me smiling in that picture because I'm sitting next to A.L. My son idolized that man. He just followed in his footsteps. David was maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. A.L. used to sit and brag about this man he beat the hell out of, and that man he stabbed, and this man he shot, and shit like that, and he never did any of those things. But my son thought he did. And I guess he just thought it was acceptable. My brother could have helped him, but instead of going the right way, he went the wrong way, and he taught him things that he shouldn't have taught him. Since David wasn't mentally capable of thinking the consequences about things, and A.L. seemed to get away with everything, I guess he thought it was okay. My son's always taking the blame for everything, whether he did it or not. Always. And there are things that he has gone to jail for that I know for a fact that he did not do. That I know that my brother A.L. did. And that's why I asked him who was with him when he did what he did. He told me no one. I keep hoping eventually that he will tell me the truth about that night. But my brother A.L. instilled in him that you don't rat on nobody. You don't tell on nobody, period.
The call came into the police department, and it was out of the blue. I didn't know Mr. Thompson. As a matter of fact, I couldn't even get a address from him. All he told me is that his nephew came to the residence, and he was sweating profusely and was tired, and the little bit of blood that he had on his hand, and he told Mr. Thompson that he had stabbed somebody. With the information that he gave me and me checking the information, it was good enough to get Mr. Lewis apprehended and arrested. David didn't want to talk at first. And I read him his rights. Just to let him know that I was going to speak to him in reference to it and everything. And he really didn't want to give me very much information. I said, let me tell you what happened, and you tell me if it did or not. I gave him the sequence of the crime that was committed. This happened, this is you ran to your uncle's, sweating, tired, blood on your hand, the only stabbing in Freeport that night. Never did I tell him he did it. Never did I tell him he didn't do it. Now it's on you if you're going to tell me what happened or not. I want your side of the story. And all he said, we looked at me, he said, okay, and that was it. He says, I don't want to talk to him. I said, okay. So to me, when he said okay, that was a confession for me, you know.
When I learned that law enforcement had taken a confession to an unrelated stabbing that supposedly was committed by the defendant before he came to Angelina County, I would say livid is getting closer to how I felt about that. I was extremely angry. That confession was taken at a point in time where I had already been appointed as David Lewis's counsel, and so I'm on the record as representing him. So the law would require, if a confession is to be taken after the defendant has counsel, that confession requires the consent of the defendant's counsel. I was not notified of their visit here. I was not notified of their intention to take a confession. The confession did come into evidence, and I can't help but think that plays a role in what the jury sees about future dangerousness. Because if you got one event in a person's life that involves violence, then that may be some indication of what they're capable of doing and what they might do in the future. But if you have, unrelated to that, another violent act, then it's much easier for a jury to imagine that, yes, this person is going to be a future danger to society, and therefore answer that question in the affirmative.
"54 years passed before the name Diane Cusick returned to the center of a murder investigation, and when it finally did, the breakthrough came from evidence that had been waiting since 1968. Not a new witness, not a confession made at the scene, not a forgotten photograph. DNA, a biological trace preserved from a crime that happened more than half a century earlier, suddenly pointed investigators toward one of New York's most notorious convicted serial killers, Richard Cottingham, the man later known as the Torso Killer. On February 16th, still 1968, Diane Cusick was supposed to be doing something completely ordinary. She was 23 years old, a mother, and a dance teacher on Long Island. She had gone to Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, New York, to buy a pair of dance shoes. It was an ordinary errand in the middle of an ordinary day. Nothing about it suggested that Diane would become the victim of a crime that would remain unsolved for decades. She had a 4-year-old daughter, Darlene, who was still far too young to understand that the last time she saw her mother would become a memory frozen in childhood. Diane left her daughter with her parents and went to the mall. Then she disappeared. Hours passed. Diane did not come home. The ordinary errand had become a disappearance, and somewhere around the shopping center, investigators later believed, Diane encountered the man who would eventually be identified as her killer. Her body was discovered inside her car in the parking lot near Green Acres Mall. The scene was horrifying. Diane had been brutally assaulted. Investigators found evidence that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. Adhesive tape had been used around her mouth and neck. She had defensive injuries on her hands, suggesting that she had fought back. The medical evidence showed that this was not an accidental death. Someone had attacked Diane with extreme violence. Someone had taken a young mother who had gone to buy shoes and turned an ordinary afternoon into a murder scene. But in 1968, investigators faced a problem that would define the case for more than 5 decades. They could collect evidence, but they could not use DNA profiling the way investigators can today. Biological evidence could be preserved, but the technology required to identify its source did not yet exist. The evidence could wait. Science could not yet read it. That distinction would become crucial many years later. At the time, detectives had to work with what they could see and what witnesses could tell them. They examined Diane's vehicle. They examined the physical evidence. They reconstructed her movements. They tried to determine who could have approached her at the mall, but there was no modern genetic database waiting to compare a biological profile against thousands or millions of records. There was no digital forensic network. There was no guarantee that evidence collected from Diane's body would ever identify the person who had attacked her. The case went cold. Diane's family was left with questions that had no answer. Her daughter was only 4 years old when her mother was killed. She would grow up knowing Diane primarily through photographs and stories rather than memories of an adult life shared together. The years that followed could not restore what had been lost. Diane would never watch her daughter grow up. She would never see the milestones that followed. She would never know what kind of woman her little girl would become. And the person responsible for her death remained unidentified. The case became one more unsolved homicide in the long history of American cold cases. Then time began to change the meaning of the evidence. The biological material collected during the original investigation remained part of the case. Decades passed. Forensic science advanced. DNA profiling became one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. A biological trace could suddenly become a name. An old crime scene could suddenly produce a modern suspect. A case that had been silent for decades could suddenly speak. In Diane's case, that moment eventually arrived. But the name that emerged was not the name of an obscure suspect who had vanished into history. It was Richard Cottingham. By the time investigators connected him to Diane's murder, Cottingham was already one of the most notorious serial killers in the New York metropolitan area. He had been convicted of multiple murders and was serving a life sentence in New Jersey. He had become known as the Torso Killer, a nickname associated with the mutilation and dismemberment of some of his victims. His crimes had already established a terrifying pattern. But when Diane was murdered in 1968, Cottingham had not yet been publicly identified as the predator he would later become known to be. He was a young man in his early 20s. He was married. He worked as a computer programmer for an insurance company. On the surface, his life did not resemble the image of the serial killer that would eventually emerge. That contrast makes the Diane Cusick case even more disturbing. The man investigators eventually connected to her murder was not a stranger who had been waiting in prison for decades. He had lived an ordinary-looking life while a murder investigation remained open. He had gone to work. He had lived in the community. He had moved through the same world as everyone else, and the evidence from Diane's case remained behind. The investigation into Diane's death continued to exist in the background even as other crimes eventually exposed Cottingham. By the late 1970s, investigators had begun to recognize a pattern of brutal crimes associated with him. In 1980, his criminal career finally collapsed after a young woman survived an attack in a New Jersey motel and police arrested him. The investigation that followed revealed a horrifying history. Cottingham was convicted of several murders and other violent crimes. Over the years, he became linked to multiple killings in New York and New Jersey, but Diane Cusick's case remained officially unresolved. The man who would eventually be known as the Torso Killer had not been charged with her murder. There was no courtroom conclusion, no conviction, no definitive legal answer, only an old file and biological evidence that had been collected when forensic DNA science did not yet exist. Then came another major development. In 2016, Cottingham's DNA entered a national database after he pleaded guilty to another killing in New Jersey. That created something investigators had never possessed in 1968, a reference profile. Now old evidence could potentially be compared against him. The significance of that possibility would not become clear immediately. It took another investigation and renewed attention to cold cases in Nassau County before detectives returned to the evidence from Diane's murder. In 2021, Nassau County investigators began looking again at old cases and considering whether Cottingham could be responsible for additional killings. They revisited DNA evidence. They searched for connections that had been impossible to establish decades earlier, and the old evidence from Diane's case was tested again. The results changed everything. Investigators developed a DNA profile from evidence connected to Diane's murder and found that it matched Cottingham. A case that had remained unresolved since February 1968 suddenly had a suspect, not merely a theory, not merely a name from an old investigative file, a forensic connection. More than 50 years after Diane had been killed, modern science had found a link that investigators in 1968 could never have made. The discovery was described by Nassau County District Attorney Ann Donnelly as the product of advances in DNA technology and cooperation between prosecutors and the Nassau County Police Department. For Diane's family, the development was overwhelming. Her daughter, Darlene, had been only 4 years old when her mother died. Now she was an adult, looking at a man on a courtroom video screen who was being accused of killing the mother she barely remembered. The passage of time had not erased Diane's murder. It had only delayed the moment when the evidence could identify the person responsible. In June 2022, Cottingham was formally charged with Diane's murder. He initially pleaded not guilty. The case was now moving through the legal system more than half a century after the crime, and that alone made it extraordinary. A homicide from 1968 had become an active prosecution in 2022 because biological evidence had survived long enough for science to catch up. The case represented something larger than one arrest. It demonstrated the power of preserving evidence. It showed that a biological trace collected decades earlier could remain meaningful long after investigators had exhausted the technology available to them. Diane's case had not been solved because someone suddenly remembered everything. It had been solved because the past had left behind evidence that could still be examined. And behind that scientific breakthrough was a woman whose life had been reduced for decades to the word unsolved. Diane Cusick was 23 when she went to Green Acres Mall. She was a mother. She was a dance teacher. She was supposed to return home. Instead, she was found dead in her car. Her daughter grew up without her. Her family waited. Investigators waited. The evidence waited. And somewhere inside the forensic material preserved from that terrible scene was a biological signature belonging to a man who would eventually become one of America's most notorious serial killers. For more than 5 decades, that evidence remained silent. Then science gave it a voice. And when it finally spoke, it pointed directly toward Richard Cottingham. The murder of Diane Cusick did not begin with a mysterious stranger emerging from the darkness. It began in daylight, in a place where hundreds of people were moving through their ordinary routine. Green Acres Mall was the kind of place where a person could disappear into a crowd without attracting attention. On February 16th, still 1968, Diane had gone there for something as ordinary as buying dance shoes. She was 23 years old, a young mother and dance instructor, and there was nothing about that trip that suggested she was walking into the final hours of her life. She had left her 4-year-old daughter with her parents, expecting to return. Instead, her routine ended in violence. Her body was later found inside her car in the mall parking area, and investigators were confronted with a crime scene that immediately raised questions about what had happened between Diane entering the shopping center and her death. The evidence showed that she had suffered a violent attack. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. Tape had been used around her mouth and neck, and injuries to her hands indicated that she had fought against her attacker. Those details transformed the case from a disappearance into a homicide investigation almost immediately. Investigators knew Diane had been killed. What they did not know was who had done it, how the attacker had approached her, or whether he had been watching her before she ever reached the parking lot. At the time, detectives had no genetic database to consult. DNA profiling did not yet exist as the investigative tool it would later become. The physical evidence could tell them what had happened to Diane, but it could not yet give them a name. That limitation would define the case for decades. Investigators had to build their theory through traditional police work. They examined the vehicle. They considered Diane's movement. They looked for witnesses who might have seen her before the attack. They searched for anything that could identify the person responsible. But a crime committed in a crowded public location does not necessarily produce a useful eyewitness. People remember faces differently. They may notice a vehicle without remembering its occupants. They may see a person for only a few seconds and never realize that what they witnessed will become important. And in 1968, even a witness who could describe a suspect had no photograph database or digital system capable of rapidly comparing that description against thousands of records. The investigation therefore depended on information that was difficult to obtain and even more difficult to preserve. Diane's family was left facing a different kind of investigation. For detectives, the case was an unsolved homicide. For Diane's daughter, it was the disappearance of her mother. She was only 4 years old. The psychological weight of that loss would continue long after police files were placed into storage. A child who should have been growing up with her mother instead grew up with photographs, memories preserved by other people, and an absence that could never be explained. There was no conviction to provide accountability. There was no final courtroom moment. There was only the knowledge that Diane had gone to a shopping mall and never returned. And as the years passed, the case became increasingly difficult to solve. Investigators changed, technology changed, communities changed, but the unanswered question remained the same. Who killed Diane Cusick? The answer would eventually emerge from a man whose name would become synonymous with a completely different series of crimes. Richard Cottingham was not initially identified as the killer of Diane. In 1968, he was still a relatively young man living an apparently ordinary life. He was married and worked in the insurance industry. Nothing about his public identity suggested that he would later become associated with multiple murders and a reputation as one of the most notorious serial killers in the New York and New Jersey region. But years later, investigators would begin assembling the pieces of Cottingham's criminal history. His eventual arrest in 1980 exposed a pattern of violence that had been developing for years. He was convicted of multiple murders, and his crimes became associated with extreme brutality. The nickname Torso Killer emerged from cases involving victims whose bodies had been mutilated or dismembered. Yet the crimes for which Cottingham was eventually convicted represented only part of the mystery surrounding his activities. Investigators continued to examine unsolved killings from the period in which he was believed to have been acted. That created an extraordinary possibility. What if a murder committed before his known crimes could also be connected to him? What if the biological evidence from an old case could finally be compared against his DNA? That possibility became realistic as forensic science evolved. DNA profiling had transformed criminal investigation. Instead of relying solely on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, confessions, or physical descriptions, investigators could examine biological material left behind at a crime scene. A genetic profile could be compared with a known suspect. It could also be entered into a database. A person who had never been considered a suspect in the original investigation could suddenly become identifiable decades later. Diane's case contained preserved biological evidence, and that evidence eventually became the key. The breakthrough did not happen immediately after Cottingham's conviction. It required time, renewed investigative attention, and advances in forensic technology. Cottingham's DNA eventually became available for comparison after his later criminal proceeding. That created a reference point investigators had never possessed in 1968. Now, the old evidence could be tested against a known genetic profile. For Diane's family, this was more than a technical development. It represented the possibility that the name of her killer might finally be known. But before investigators could reach that point, they had to overcome the central problem of every cold case: time. 50 years can destroy evidence. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Documents disappear. Buildings are demolished. Streets change. People move away. Investigators retire. The original detectives may no longer be alive to explain what they saw or why they made certain decisions. A cold case is therefore not simply an old case. It is an investigation forced to operate without many of the resources that existed at the beginning. Yet Diane's case retained something incredibly important. Physical evidence had survived. That evidence preserved information that witnesses could no longer provide. It was a silent record of the crime, and as forensic science became more sophisticated, investigators could return to that record with questions that detectives in 1968 could not have asked. The importance of preservation cannot be overstated. Evidence collected decades ago may appear insignificant when first examined. A biological trace may be stored because investigators know it could matter, even though they have no technology capable of interpreting it. Years later, the scientific landscape changes. What was once merely a sample becomes a potential identification. Diane's case demonstrated exactly that transformation. The evidence did not become younger. The evidence did not change. Science changed around it. By the time investigators revisited the case, they were operating in a world where DNA could provide extraordinarily powerful identification. The question was no longer whether the killer had left biological evidence behind. The question was whether the preserved evidence still contained enough information to identify him. When the testing eventually connected the evidence to Richard Cottingham, the case entered an entirely new phase. A murder that had been unresolved since 1968 suddenly had a suspect with a documented history of extreme violence. That did not automatically prove that Cottingham had committed Diane's murder. Investigators still needed to establish the forensic connection and determine whether the evidence was reliable. But the result was impossible to ignore. The same man already convicted of other killings was now linked through DNA to a young woman murdered more than half a century earlier. The discovery also raised a disturbing question about Cottingham's timeline. If he was responsible for Diane's death, then his violence had begun earlier than some investigators might previously have understood. The murder would place him in the Long Island area in 1968 and potentially expand the known scope of his criminal activity for Diane's family. However, the significance was much more personal. They did not need a larger theory about a serial killer. They needed the truth about Diane. Her daughter had spent her entire life knowing that her mother had been murdered, but not knowing who was responsible. Now, after more than 5 decades, investigators were finally pointing toward a name. The emotional impact of such a development is difficult to measure. The person accused of killing Diane had been living behind bars for years. The possibility that he had been responsible for her death had existed without the family knowing. The killer had not disappeared into the wilderness. He had been identified in other cases and was already serving a life sentence. Yet Diane's family had been waiting for the connection to be made. When the DNA evidence finally created that link, it transformed the meaning of the old case file. The name Diane Cusick no longer belonged only to an unsolved murder from 1968. It became part of the documented history of one of the most notorious serial killers in the region. But the legal system still required proof. An investigative breakthrough and a criminal conviction are not the same thing. Prosecutors had to establish that the DNA evidence was connected to the murder and that the identification could withstand legal scrutiny. Cottingham initially denied responsibility and pleaded not guilty when charged. The case therefore moved from the laboratory into the courtroom, and that transition created another challenge. More than 50 years had passed. Memories had faded. Witnesses from 1968 were now elderly or deceased. The original crime scene existed only through photographs, reports, preserved evidence, and testimony that could still be presented. The prosecution could not simply ask the court to imagine what investigators had seen in 1968. It had to reconstruct the case through admissible evidence. Yet the very age of the case also made the DNA connection extraordinarily significant. A biological profile does not forget. It does not change its memory because 50 years have passed. If the evidence was properly preserved and the laboratory analysis was sound, the genetic connection could bridge a gap that traditional investigative methods could never cross. That was the power of the breakthrough. Diane's murder had survived as an unanswered question for generations. Then a scientific method developed long after her death provided investigators with something the original detectives could never obtain: a direct biological link to a known individual. The case had crossed from 1968 into the modern forensic era, and with that transition came a chilling realization. The evidence had been waiting all along. The killer had left something behind. Investigators simply had to wait until science became capable of reading it. More than 50 years after Diane entered Green Acres Mall to buy dance shoes, the investigation was finally moving toward a name, a prosecution, and the possibility of accountability. But before that possibility could become a legal conclusion, investigators would have to reconstruct the man behind the DNA profile, the crimes that made him infamous, and the hidden timeline that could place Richard Cottingham at the center of Diane Cusick's final hour. The name Richard Cottingham carried a weight that Diane Cusick's family had not known when her murder first went cold. In 1968, investigators were searching for an unknown man who had attacked a young woman at a Long Island shopping mall. More than a decade later, police would arrest Cottingham in connection with a separate violent crime, and the investigation that followed would reveal a far more disturbing picture. That later history would eventually become impossible to separate from the Diane Cusick investigation. But the danger of looking backward is that investigators already know how the story ends. In 1968, they did not. They did not know that the man they were looking for would one day be identified as a serial killer. They did not know his name. They did not know the pattern that would emerge years later. They had only a young woman's body, a brutal crime scene, and a family desperate for answers. Richard Cottingham was born in 1946 and grew up in New Jersey. By the time Diane was killed, he was in his early 20s. He was married and employed, living what appeared from the outside to be a conventional life. That apparent normality would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Serial offenders rarely announce themselves to the people around them. They can work, maintain relationships, interact with neighbors, and move through ordinary communities while concealing violent behavior. Cottingham's public life gave investigators no obvious reason in 1968 to connect him to Diane's murder. There was no established record of him as the notorious killer he would later become. The pattern had not yet been exposed. Diane's murder, therefore, stood alone. A young woman had gone to a shopping mall. She was found dead in her car. Investigators knew the attack had been violent, but the identity of the attacker remained unknown. The investigation had to proceed without the benefit of hindsight. That is important because it explains why the case remained unsolved for so long. It was not simply a matter of detectives overlooking an obvious suspect. They were operating with limited forensic technology and incomplete information. The killer had not yet been publicly identified as part of a broader pattern, and the biological evidence could not provide the answer it would eventually provide decades later. The development of DNA profiling changed that equation. Once investigators could create a genetic profile from biological evidence, an old crime scene could become a source of information rather than simply a historical record. The process was not instantaneous. Evidence had to be located, evaluated, tested, and compared. But every year that forensic technology improved created another possibility that an old case might finally yield a name. Diane's case contained the kind of biological evidence that could become crucial. Investigators had preserved evidence associated with the sexual assault and murder. At the time, the significance of that evidence was limited by the technology available. Decades later, it became potentially identifying. Meanwhile, Cottingham's own criminal history was expanded. In the 1970s, several women were murdered in New York and New Jersey under circumstances that would eventually be associated with him. His crimes involved sexual violence and, in some cases, extreme mutilation. The brutality of those later killings would eventually earn him the nickname Torso Killer. But a nickname created by later crimes cannot be projected backward as proof of an earlier crime. Investigators still needed independent evidence connecting Cottingham to Diane. That distinction would become critical when the cold case was reopened. The fact that Cottingham was a convicted serial killer made him a compelling suspect, But it was the DNA evidence that transformed suspicion into a specific forensic lead. That is what separated Diane's case from a theory. Investigators were not simply saying he killed other women, so he must have killed Diane. They were saying that biological evidence collected in connection with Diane's murder matched Cottingham's DNA profile. The distinction is fundamental. A suspect's reputation can explain why investigators look at him. It cannot by itself prove that he committed a particular murder. The forensic evidence was therefore the bridge between Cottingham's known history and Diane's unsolved case. The bridge had taken decades to build. When Cottingham was arrested in 1980, police were finally able to examine his life and activities more closely. His conviction and imprisonment meant that his identity was known to authorities. But for years, that did not automatically connect him to Diane. Her case remained unresolved. The possibility that he might have been involved could be considered, but without the evidence needed to establish the connection, it remained speculation. The turning point came much later after advances in DNA science and renewed cold case investigation. Investigators began re-examining cases in which preserved biological evidence could potentially produce modern DNA results. Diane's murder was one of them. The case was no longer being treated as an old file that had reached the end of its possibilities. It became a scientific question. Could the evidence collected in 1968 still produce a usable DNA profile? Could that profile be compared to Cottingham? And if there was a match, what exactly would it mean? The answers began to emerge as forensic testing progressed. The DNA evidence pointed toward Cottingham. That development was extraordinary because of the distance between the crime and the identification. More than 50 years separated the murder from the forensic breakthrough. The evidence had crossed an enormous gap in time. Diane's daughter had grown from a 4-year-old child into an adult. The investigators who first worked the case had long since retired or passed away. The world around Green Acres Mall had changed. Technology had transformed everyday life, yet the biological evidence remained capable of connecting the past to the present. That is the central power of forensic cold case work. Time can erase human memory, but it cannot necessarily erase biological information. A fingerprint can remain. A DNA profile can remain. A photograph can remain. A piece of clothing can remain. If preserved correctly, physical evidence can outlive everyone who remembers the original crime. That means an investigation can sometimes restart, not because someone remembers more, but because science can finally understand what was already there. For Diane's family, the development was deeply emotional. Her daughter, Darlene, had been only 4 when Diane was murdered. She had grown up without the person who should have been there through childhood and adulthood. For decades, the family had known that Diane was murdered, but had no definitive answer about who was responsible. Now the name Richard Cottingham was connected to her mother's death. The accused killer was not a mysterious figure from the past. He was a convicted serial killer already serving a life sentence. That fact carried its own emotional force. The family did not have to imagine what the accused might have done in other cases. Cottingham's criminal history was already documented, but Diane's case still required its own proof. The investigation, therefore, focused on the evidence specific to her murder. Detectives examined the DNA results and the historical record. Prosecutors reviewed the circumstances surrounding the crime. They considered how the evidence could be presented decades after the event. And the more they examined the case, the more significant the preserved biological evidence became. It offered something the investigation had never had before, a scientific connection between Diane's murder and a known person. Yet even with that breakthrough, the story was not simple. The case involved evidence collected under investigative standards from another era. Modern prosecutors had to establish a chain of custody and explain how the evidence had been preserved. They had to demonstrate that the DNA testing was reliable. They had to show that the profile was consistent with Cottingham and that the circumstances supported the conclusion that the biological material was connected to the crime. Defense attorneys could challenge those points. A half-century-old case does not automatically become easy because DNA is available. In fact, the age of the evidence can create additional legal questions. Was it stored correctly? Could contamination have occurred? Was the sample properly documented? How was the DNA profile generated? What statistical significance does the match have? Each question mattered, but investigators had something that earlier generations did not: sophisticated forensic laboratories and decades of accumulated knowledge about DNA evidence. The technology could provide answers with a precision unimaginable in 1968. As the case moved forward, another uncomfortable possibility became impossible to ignore. If Cottingham was responsible for Diane's murder, then his violent criminal activity stretched back to a time before many of the crimes for which he was already known. Diane's killing would not simply be another cold case solved. It would potentially expand the known chronology of his criminal behavior. It would mean that a man who later became notorious for murdering women had already committed a violent attack years before his crimes were publicly exposed. For historians of crime and investigators studying serial offenders, that possibility was significant. Serial offenders often have undiscovered victims. A known offender's conviction history may represent only the crimes that authorities were able to prove. Cold cases can reveal the difference between a criminal record and a criminal history. A conviction establishes what was proven in court. A cold case investigation can reveal what may have remained hidden. But again, the evidence has to stand on its own. Diane could not simply be added to a list because Cottingham was capable of violence. The forensic connection had to be established. That was why the DNA breakthrough was so important. It provided a direct investigative path rather than a theory based solely on behavior. The case had entered a new era. The question was no longer whether investigators had forgotten Diane. They had not. Her file had survived. Her evidence had survived. Her family had never stopped carrying the law. The question was whether modern science could finally turn that preserved evidence into an identification, and it had. The match with Cottingham created a bridge between two worlds: the ordinary afternoon when Diane went to buy dance shoes in 1968, and the forensic investigation more than 5 decades later. Between those moments lay a history of violence, investigation, imprisonment, technological change, and unanswered questions. The man at the end of that forensic trail was already serving a life sentence for other crimes. But for Diane's family, that was not enough. They needed her case addressed on its own terms. They needed the law to recognize what had happened to her, and they needed the name of the person responsible to move from a scientific database into a courtroom. That transition finally came in 2022 when Cottingham was charged with Diane's murder. The charge transformed the cold case into a live criminal prosecution. More than 50 years after Diane's death, the investigation had finally produced a defendant. But a charge was only the beginning. The prosecution now had to prove its case. The DNA evidence would have to withstand scrutiny. The history would have to be reconstructed, and the courtroom would have to decide whether the evidence established beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Cottingham was the man who ended Diane Cusick's life on that February afternoon in 1968. For more than half a century, the most important evidence in the Diane Cusick murder case existed in a world where its true power could not yet be understood. In 1968, investigators could document a crime scene, collect biological material, photograph injuries, preserve clothing, and interview witnesses, but they could not perform the kind of DNA identification that would eventually transform Diane's case. The evidence was there. The technology was not. That gap between evidence and technology became the defining feature of the investigation. Diane's murder was not forgotten because her family stopped caring or because detectives simply abandoned the case. It remained unresolved because the person responsible had left behind evidence that could not yet be translated into an identity. And while the case sat in that silence, the man eventually connected to it continued living a life that would later become one of the darkest criminal histories in the New York metropolitan area. Richard Cottingham had been born in 1946 and was still a young man when Diane was killed. He lived in New Jersey, was married, and worked in the insurance industry. Nothing about the public image available to investigators at the time identified him as a serial predator. He did not have the notoriety that would come later. There was no established criminal profile linking him to multiple murders. There was simply an unsolved killing at a shopping mall on Long Island. That is what made the passage of time so important. The investigators of 1968 were looking for a man they did not know. Investigators decades later were looking at an identified convicted killer and asking whether the biological evidence from older cases could finally connect him to additional victims. The difference was enormous. By the late 1970s, Cottingham's name was becoming associated with a series of brutal crimes. Women disappeared. Bodies were discovered. Investigators began seeing patterns of sexual violence and extreme mutilation. In 1980, Cottingham was arrested after a surviving victim escaped from an attack at a New Jersey motel and alerted authorities. His arrest opened the door to an investigation that would expose a horrifying history. He was eventually convicted of several murders and became known as the Torso Killer, a nickname tied to the mutilation and dismemberment of victims in some of his crimes. But even after his convictions, the full scope of his criminal activity remained uncertain. Serial murder investigations are often defined by what authorities can prove, not necessarily by everything that may have happened. A conviction establishes legal responsibility for a specific offense. It does not automatically identify every other victim. That distinction became crucial when investigators returned to Diane's case. Her murder had occurred in 1968, long before Cottingham's arrest. If the DNA evidence from Diane's case matched him, the scientific result could potentially extend his known criminal timeline backward. But investigators still had to prove that the evidence was connected to the crime and that the identification was reliable. They could not simply assume that a notorious offender must be responsible for every unsolved murder that occurred in the same region. The evidence had to speak for itself. And eventually it did. The scientific revolution that made this possible began years after Diane's death. DNA profiling emerged as a powerful forensic tool during the 1980s and became increasingly sophisticated through the 1990s and 2000s. By the time investigators were examining Diane's case with modern methods, DNA could be used to distinguish individuals with extraordinary precision. Biological material that had once been little more than a preserved sample could now produce a genetic profile. That profile could be compared with a known individual's DNA. If the results matched, investigators could establish a connection that eyewitnesses might never have been able to provide. The old case suddenly had a new investigative language. Instead of asking only who had been seen near Diane, detectives could ask who had left biological material associated with the crime. Instead of relying solely on memories that had faded over decades, they could examine physical evidence that had remained preserved. Instead of searching for an unknown face, they could compare a genetic profile against known individuals. This did not make the investigation simple. It made it possible. When Cottingham's DNA became available for comparison through later criminal proceedings, investigators gained a reference profile. That reference profile eventually became critical to the Diane Cusick investigation. The old biological evidence could now be examined in a way that would have been impossible in 1968. The significance of the eventual match was not merely that Cottingham had a history of murder. It was that evidence associated with Diane's case produced a genetic connection to him. That was the kind of development that could transform an investigation from a historical mystery into a prosecutable case. But before that happened, investigators had to revisit the original evidence carefully. In a cold case, evidence cannot simply be assumed to be reliable because it is old. Its history must be examined. Where was it stored? Who handled it? Was the chain of custody documented? Could contamination have occurred? What biological material was available? What modern testing method was used? Could the result be independently verified? Every question matters because the courtroom is not a laboratory demonstration. The prosecution must show that the evidence is trustworthy. The defense has the right to challenge it. The older the evidence, the more important that foundation can become. Diane's case had another major challenge. Time had changed the people involved. Some witnesses were no longer alive. Others were elderly. Investigators who had worked the original case had retired. The shopping mall and surrounding community had changed dramatically. Memories that might once have been clear were now decades old. This is why physical evidence can be so valuable in a cold case. Human memory is vulnerable to time. Biological evidence, if properly preserved, can remain stable. The evidence can survive the people who collected it. It can survive the investigators who first examined it. It can survive changes in technology, and eventually, if science advances far enough, it can reveal information that was invisible when the evidence was first collected. That is exactly what happened in Diane's case. The biological material associated with her murder became the bridge between 1968 and the modern investigation. For her daughter, Darlene, that bridge carried an especially heavy emotional burden. She had been only 4 years old when Diane was killed. Her childhood had been defined by an absence she could never understand in the way an adult might. There were photographs. There were stories. There was the knowledge that her mother had been murdered, but there was no person who could answer every question about Diane's final hours. There was no courtroom verdict to place responsibility on someone. For decades, the family had to live with the fact that the person responsible had not been identified. Then the name Richard Cottingham entered the story. It was not the conclusion they had expected. The man was already infamous. He was already serving a life sentence. His criminal history was already established, but the DNA evidence meant that Diane's case could finally be considered on its own terms. The investigation could move from the question of whether Cottingham was capable of such a crime to the far more important question of whether the evidence showed that he actually committed this particular murder. That distinction is central to justice. A person's criminal history can make a theory compelling, but it cannot replace proof. The DNA evidence therefore became the critical link. According to investigators, testing connected biological material from Diane's case to Cottingham. The discovery was announced decades after the murder and transformed a case that had resisted resolution since 1968. For the first time, prosecutors could identify a specific person associated with the evidence. In June 2022, Cottingham was charged with Diane's murder. He pleaded not guilty. The charge marked the beginning of a legal process that would attempt to translate 54 years of investigative history into a courtroom case. That process carried its own challenges. The prosecution had to explain what happened in 1968. It had to explain the physical evidence. It had to explain the DNA. It had to establish why the biological connection mattered, and it had to do all of this while working with a crime that had occurred more than half a century earlier. The defense, meanwhile, could challenge the interpretation of the evidence and the reliability of the investigative conclusions. That is why the phrase cold case solved can be misleading. An investigative agency may regard a case as solved when it has identified the likely perpetrator and gathered evidence sufficient for charges. But a legal case is not truly concluded until the court determines guilt or innocence. Diane's murder had reached an extraordinary stage, but it still had to pass through the justice system. The scientific breakthrough, nevertheless, changed the family's relationship with the case. For decades, the investigation had been defined by uncertainty. Now there was a name. There was a genetic connection. There was a defendant. There was a path toward accountability. And behind that path was a simple fact that had never changed. Diane had gone to a shopping mall to buy dance shoes and never came home. Her daughter had been 4 years old. Her family had been forced to continue without her. The person responsible had remained hidden behind the limitations of 20th century forensic science, but the evidence had survived. More than 5 decades later, science finally caught up with it. The old crime scene could now speak in a language that investigators in 1968 had never heard. It pointed toward Richard Cottingham, and suddenly, a murder that had lived for generations as an unanswered question was standing at the edge of a courtroom waiting for the evidence to determine whether the man behind that DNA profile was legally responsible for the death of Diane Cusick. The breakthrough in Diane Cusick's murder did not end with a DNA match. It began a far more consequential process, turning a forensic discovery into a courtroom case and ultimately into an admission of guilt. For investigators, the DNA result was extraordinary. For Diane's family, it was something more profound. It meant that after 54 years, the woman responsible for her death was no longer an unidentified figure in an old police file. Richard Cottingham had a name, a criminal history, and a genetic profile that connected him to evidence preserved from the 1968 crime. But there was still a long road between identification and justice. When Nassau County prosecutors announced the indictment in June 2022, They described the case as one solved because of advances in DNA technology. Evidence connected to Diane's murder had been retested in 2021 by the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner, Division of Forensic Sciences. In early 2022, investigators generated a DNA profile from that evidence and said it matched Cottingham's profile. The breakthrough was remarkable precisely because of the age of the evidence. Diane had been dead for more than 5 decades, yet something collected at the original crime scene had survived long enough to be analyzed with technology that did not exist when she was killed. On June 22, still 2022, Cottingham appeared virtually before a Nassau County judge from prison. He was 75 years old and already serving a life sentence in New Jersey for other murder. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree murder in Diane's death. He pleaded not guilty. The courtroom proceeding was separated from the emotional weight of the investigation by a simple legal principle. The charge was an accusation, and Cottingham was presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. But outside the courtroom, Diane's family was confronting something they had waited decades to hear. Her daughter, Darlene, had been only 4 years old when her mother was killed. She had spent most of her life with an absence that could never be repaired. Now, suddenly, investigators were telling her that DNA had connected her mother's murder to Richard Cottingham. The news did not erase the grief. It changed its shape. For decades, the family had known that Diane had been murdered, but had no definitive answer about who was responsible. Now there was a specific suspect, and he was already behind bars. The possibility of justice was no longer theoretical. It had entered a courtroom, but the most disturbing part of the case was that Cottingham had not been a random name produced by a database. By 2022, his criminal history was already notorious. He had been convicted of multiple murders and had become known as the Torso Killer, a name associated with the mutilation and dismemberment of several victims. His known crimes had established him as a serial killer operating in the New York and New Jersey region. Yet Diane's murder occurred in 1968, years before the crimes that eventually led to his arrest and conviction. If the DNA evidence was correct, it meant his known history extended further back than many people had understood. It meant that a young mother who had gone to a shopping mall to buy shoes had potentially been one of the earliest victims whose connection to Cottingham could be established through modern forensic science. The investigation also revealed how the crime may have unfolded. Authorities believed Cottingham approached Diane as she left the mall, possibly pretending to be a security guard or police officer and accusing her of stealing. Investigators believed the deception allowed him to gain control of her before forcing her into the back of her car. These details were investigative conclusions, not something Diane could confirm herself. But they offered a possible explanation for how a young woman could have been abducted from a public shopping center without immediately attracting attention. The medical evidence provided a darker picture. Diane had been beaten. She had been assaulted. She had defensive injuries on her hands. An adhesive strip was found over her mouth, and her hands had been bound. The medical examiner determined that she died from asphyxiation caused by strangulation. The violence of the attack stood in stark contrast to the ordinary purpose of Diane's trip. She had gone to buy dancing shoes. She was not searching for danger. She was carrying out a routine errand. That ordinary beginning made the ending even more devastating. Her family had expected her home. Instead, her parents eventually went looking for her. They found her Plymouth Valiant in the Green Acres Mall parking lot, and inside the vehicle, they discovered the body of their daughter. The official investigation began that night, but the technology needed to identify her killer was decades away. This is one of the most haunting aspects of cold cases. The answer can exist physically long before investigators are capable of recognizing it. In Diane's case, the biological evidence was already there. The DNA of the attacker had potentially been preserved at the crime scene, but in 1968, investigators could not turn that evidence into a name. They had no genetic database. There was no modern DNA profiling system. There was no national mechanism that could compare a crime scene profile against a convicted offender. Years later, the evidence could be stored, but it could not speak. Then the science changed. DNA became a central tool in forensic investigation. Cottingham's own DNA eventually became available to investigators through the criminal justice system. According to reporting, his profile was entered into a national database in 2016 after he pleaded guilty to another New Jersey killing. That reference profile eventually gave investigators the opportunity to compare him with evidence from older, unsolved cases. In 2021, Nassau investigators revisited the evidence from Diane's case. The old sample was tested again. This time, the laboratory could generate information that detectives in 1968 could never have obtained. The result was a match to Cottingham. That single scientific development transformed the investigation. It did not rewrite history. It revealed something history had been carrying all along. Diane's murder had never stopped being a crime. It had simply remained unidentified. The evidence had been preserved. The victim's identity had always been known. The missing piece was the perpetrator. Now investigators had him. But the case contained another extraordinary dimension. Cottingham's later crimes suggested a pattern of behavior. He had been convicted of murders committed in New York and New Jersey, and investigators believed he was responsible for more victims than those for which he had been convicted. In cold case investigations involving serial offenders, detectives often examine older, unsolved murders to determine whether the same offender could have been responsible. The process is complicated. Similarities can generate leads, but they cannot replace evidence. A serial killer's known behavior may help investigators decide where to look, but each victim requires her own proof. Diane's case had that independent forensic evidence. The DNA match gave investigators a reason to believe that her murder belonged in Cottingham's criminal history, and the story would not end with the indictment. In the months after the charge, prosecutors continued developing the case. Cottingham remained incarcerated in New Jersey, already serving a life sentence for other crimes. He had little prospect of ever returning to ordinary life, but the legal significance of Diane's case was still enormous. A murder that had remained unresolved since 1968 was now proceeding through the court. Then, on December 5th, 2022, the case took another dramatic turn. Cottingham pleaded guilty to Diane's murder. He also admitted responsibility for 4 additional Long Island killings from the early 1970s: Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. The plea changed the nature of the case completely. The DNA evidence had identified Cottingham. The indictment had formally accused him. Now he was admitting responsibility. For Diane's family, the significance was impossible to separate from the decades of uncertainty that had preceded it. Her daughter had been a small child when Diane was killed. More than 50 years later, she was standing in a courtroom as the man responsible admitted what he had done. Cottingham was sentenced to 25 years to life for Diane's murder. The sentence could not restore Diane. It could not return her to the daughter who had grown up without her. It could not erase the decades of unanswered questions, but it provided something the family had never had before: a legal acknowledgement that the investigation had finally reached its conclusion. The case demonstrated the extraordinary power of DNA evidence in cold case investigation. A biological sample collected in 1968 had survived for more than 50 years. Scientific technology advanced. A known offender's DNA profile became available. Investigators retested the old evidence. A match emerged, and that match became the foundation of a prosecution. The timeline is almost impossible to comprehend. Diane was murdered in February 1968. Her killer remained unidentified for decades. Cottingham was arrested in 1984, other crime. He spent the rest of his life in prison. His DNA eventually entered a national database in 2016. Investigators reopened the old evidence in 2021. A DNA profile was generated in early 2022. He was indicted in June. He pleaded guilty in December. 54 years separated the murder from the moment justice finally arrived. But there was another revelation embedded in the plea. Diane was not the only woman whose story had remained unfinished. Cottingham admitted killing 4 additional Long Island women whose cases had also remained unresolved. That meant the investigation was no longer just about one cold case. It had become a window into a larger period of violence. Each admission represented another family that had waited for answers, another victim whose name had once existed in an unresolved case file, another life interrupted by the same offender. Yet Diane's story remained distinct because her murder was the earliest of those 5 Long Island cases, and because modern DNA evidence had directly led investigators to Cottingham. Her case became an example of what can happen when preserved evidence is revisited decades later. It also demonstrated why investigators continue to maintain old evidence even when a case appears impossible to solve. Technology can change. Databases can expand. Testing methods can improve. A sample that produces no answer today may produce a decisive answer years later. The evidence does not need to know when the breakthrough will come. It only needs to survive. Diane's evidence survived. Her name survived. Her family survived the decades of waiting. And when the forensic trail was finally followed to Richard Cottingham, the case moved from mystery to prosecution, from prosecution to guilty plea, and from uncertainty to a legal conclusion. The tragedy remained. The lost years remained. The questions about Diane's final moments remained. But one question that had haunted her family since 1968 finally had an answer. Who killed Diane Cusick? The answer was Richard Cottingham. More than half a century after her murder, the silence had finally been broken. The guilty plea in December 2022 brought an extraordinary legal conclusion to Diane Cusick's murder, but it also opened a much larger window into the years when Richard Cottingham was moving through Long Island as a predator whose crimes would remain hidden for decades. For Diane's family, the most important fact was simple. After 54 years, the man responsible had finally admitted in court that he killed her. But for investigators, the case revealed something else. Diane's murder was not an isolated event in the history of Cottingham's violence. During the same plea proceeding, he admitted responsibility for 4 additional Nassau County murders committed between 1972 and 1973, 5 young women, 5 families, 5 cases that had carried unanswered questions for decades. And at the beginning of that sequence was Diane, murdered in February 1968. The official account of Diane's final night remains stark. She was 23 years old, lived in New Hyde Park, and worked as an instructor at a dancing school in Oceanside. On the evening of February 15th, she told her family she was going to Green Acres Mall to buy a pair of dancing shoes. It was supposed to be an ordinary trip. At approximately 10:30 that night, her parents became concerned because she had not returned home. They drove to the shopping center and found Diane's Plymouth Valiant in the mall parking lot. Inside the back seat was their daughter's bottle. An adhesive band covered her mouth. Her hands were bound. She had been strangled. The medical examiner determined that asphyxiation from strangulation caused her death. The scene represented a devastating contradiction. Diane had gone into a busy shopping center as a young mother and dance instructor. She had expected to buy shoes and return to her family. Instead, sometime during that ordinary trip, she encountered a killer. More than half a century later, investigators would determine that the killer was Richard Cottingham. But the path from the parking lot in 1968 to the courtroom in 2022 was not straight. It moved through decades of silence, changing forensic science, criminal investigations, and the eventual realization that an old piece of evidence could still answer a question that had survived for generations. One of the most important moments came in 2021 when certain evidence from Diane's case was retested by the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner's Division of Forensic Sciences. The original investigation had preserved material that could now be examined using modern methods. In early 2022, investigators generated a DNA profile from that evidence. According to the Nassau County District Attorney's Office, the profile matched Cottingham's. That result was the turning point. Until then, Diane's murder belonged to the category of crimes for which investigators had evidence of violence but no identified perpetrator. Suddenly, the case had a forensic connection to a known individual. Cottingham was already incarcerated in New Jersey for other murders. His identity was established, his DNA could be compared, and the evidence from Diane's murder had produced the match. The implications were enormous. A cold case from 1968 had become an active homicide investigation again. investigators were no longer searching for an unknown man somewhere in the world. They were examining a known offender whose criminal history had already demonstrated that he was capable of murder. Yet the DNA evidence was essential because it connected him specifically to Diane's case. That distinction matters. A person can have a violent criminal history without being responsible for every unsolved homicide occurring during the same period. The evidence must establish the connection. In Diane's case, investigators said the DNA did exactly that. The discovery also demonstrated why cold case investigators preserve physical evidence even when a case appears impossible to solve. In 1968, the biological material could not provide an identity. Decades later, it could. Nothing about the evidence had to change. The scientific ability to interpret it changed. That is one of the defining realities of modern forensic investigation. Time can destroy witnesses, memories, and records, but properly preserved biological evidence can sometimes remain available long after everyone who originally handled the case is gone. Diane's murder became a powerful example of that principle. The investigation also forced authorities to look more closely at Cottingham's known criminal history. By the time investigators linked him to Diane, he was already infamous. He had been convicted of multiple murders in New York and New Jersey. His crimes were associated with sexual violence and extreme brutality. He became known as the Torso Killer, a nickname connected to cases in which victims were mutilated or dismembered. But the nickname alone did not solve Diane's murder. It was the forensic evidence that brought him into the case. Then the chronology became even more disturbing. Diane was murdered in 1968, years before Cottingham's arrest. If he had killed her, then his known period of violence extended farther back than many of the crimes for which he had already been convicted. The cold case therefore had significance beyond Diane herself. It could help investigators understand the earlier stages of Cottingham's criminal activity. The plea in December 2022 strengthened that picture. Cottingham admitted in open court that he had killed Diane and 4 additional women in Nassau County: Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. The Nassau County District Attorney's Office reported that the 5 women were killed between 1968 and 1973. Their stories reveal the terrifying breadth of the investigation that had emerged from Diane's case. Mary Beth Hines was 21 when her body was discovered in Rockville Center on May 10th, Sill, 1972. She had been found face down in a muddy stream in a wooded area. The medical examiner determined that she died from strangulation. She had grown up in Mineola and was working as a mother's helper in Belmore. 2 months later, on July 20th, Sill 1972, the body of 23-year-old Laverne Moy was found in the same general area. She was a mother of 2 and was separated from her husband. She too had been strangled. Then, in July 1973, 33-year-old Sheila Hyman was found dead inside her home in North Woodmere. She was a mother of 3. Investigators determined that she had suffered severe injuries, including multiple lacerations to the skull, a fractured jaw, and a lacerated jugular vein. 5 months later, in December 1973, 18-year-old Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves was found dead near Jones Beach. She had been strangled. Her body was discovered in a weeded area near Ocean Parkway. Each of these cases had its own family, its own history, and its own unanswered questions. Each victim had been a person before becoming a case number. Each family had been forced to continue living while the circumstances of the death remained unresolved. Cottingham's admissions decades later did not restore those lives, but they gave investigators and families information that had been unavailable for generations. The 5 cases also revealed how a serial offender can remain partially hidden even after one crime has been solved. Cottingham was eventually convicted of several murders, but investigators continued to examine unsolved cases that might be connected to him. His criminal history could not be assumed to include every killing attributed to him, but it could provide investigative direction. The Diane Cusick case demonstrated the value of combining that historical knowledge with forensic evidence. Without the DNA match, investigators might have continued to regard Cottingham as one possible suspect among many. Without his known DNA profile, the biological evidence from Diane's case might not have produced the same identification. Without preserved evidence, modern DNA technology would have had nothing to analyze. The breakthrough depended on all three elements coming together: evidence from 1968, technology from a later generation, and a known DNA profile from a convicted offender. That combination turned an impossible-looking case into a prosecutable homicide. The legal conclusion came quickly once the evidence was established. Cottingham was indicted in June 2022 and pleaded not guilty at his initial arraignment. The Nassau County District Attorney's Office said he was charged with second-degree murder and faced a potential sentence of 25 years to life if convicted. 6 months later, on December 5th, the case changed again. Cottingham pleaded guilty to Diane's murder before Judge Corin Fink. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. During the same proceeding, he admitted the 4 additional Nassau County killings. Prosecutors agreed not to prosecute him separately for those 4 deaths because he was already going to spend the rest of his life incarcerated as a result of his existing convictions and the sentence in Diane's case. For Diane's daughter, the guilty plea represented the end of a question that had begun when she was a 4-year-old child. Her mother had been taken from her. The person responsible had remained unidentified for most of her life. Then, when she was an adult, science identified him. And finally, he admitted responsibility. There is no legal sentence capable of compensating for 54 years without a mother. A guilty plea cannot restore childhood memories that never existed. It cannot return the birthdays, school events, conversations, and ordinary moments that Diane should have shared with her daughter. But it can establish a fact in the public record. Diane was murdered. Richard Cottingham admitted that he was responsible. The case was no longer a mystery. It had become history. Yet even after the guilty plea, the story raises a deeper question about what happens to cold cases before technology makes them solvable. Diane's murder was investigated in an era when DNA identification was unimaginable. The investigators could not know that evidence collected from her body might one day identify her killer. They could only preserve what they could and pursue the information available to them. Their work became the foundation for a future investigation. That is, the unseen continuity of forensic science. The detective in 1968 and the forensic analyst decades later may never meet, but they can become part of the same investigation. One collects evidence. Another interprets it. One records observations. Another applies technology that did not yet exist. One generation asks questions that another generation eventually answers. Diane's case crossed that entire span of time, and the final answer was not discovered because the past was forgotten. It was discovered because the past was preserved. The old evidence survived. The DNA profile became possible. The comparison was made. The result pointed to Cottingham. Then the legal system completed the process. A murder that had remained unresolved since February 1968 finally ended with a guilty plea and a sentence of 25 years to life. But the most haunting fact remains the simplest one. Diane had not been doing anything dangerous. She had gone shopping. She had gone to buy dance shoes. She expected to return to her family. Instead, her parents found her in the back seat of her own car. More than 50 years later, the evidence from that car and that crime scene would help reveal the identity of the man who killed her. The case had waited through an entire generation. It had survived the disappearance of memories and the aging of witnesses. It had survived the limitations of 1968 forensic science. And when the technology finally became capable of reading what had been preserved, the answer was still there. Diane Cusick's murder became a cold case because the evidence could not yet speak. It was solved because, eventually, science learned how to listen. The story of Diane Cusick's murder is often reduced to a single phrase: a 54-year-old cold case solved by DNA. But behind that headline was a much longer story of evidence, uncertainty, and a family that had spent more than half a century without a complete answer. When investigators finally connected Richard Cottingham to Diane through forensic evidence, they were not simply closing an old file. They were reconstructing a crime committed in another era when the world around Diane looked completely different and the tools available to detectives were far more limited. That reconstruction began with the ordinary details of Diane's life because the most important fact about her story is that she was not a case number. She was a 23-year-old woman, a mother, and a dance instructor. She lived in New Hyde Park and worked at a dancing school in Oceanside. She had a 4-year-old daughter. On February 15th, still 1968, she went to Green Acres Mall because she needed a pair of dancing shoes. It was a routine trip, the kind of trip no one remembers as significant until the person who leaves never returns. Diane's family expected her home that night. When she did not come back, concern turned into fear. Her parents drove to Green Acres Mall. They found Diane's Plymouth Valiant in the parking lot. Inside was the body of their daughter. The crime scene immediately told investigators that something violent had happened. Diane had been bound and strangled. An adhesive band was found over her mouth. She had injuries consistent with a struggle. The medical examiner determined that asphyxiation from strangulation caused her death. NASADA.org. The investigation began with the questions that every homicide creates. Who had approached Diane? How had the attacker gained control of her? Had she known the person? Was she followed? Was the attack planned? And most importantly, where was the evidence that could identify the killer? Investigators collected what they could, but the science of the era placed an enormous barrier between evidence and identification. DNA profiling was not yet available. Investigators could not take a biological sample and run it through a national database. The concept of using DNA as a routine criminal identification tool belonged to the future. In 1968, detectives had to rely on fingerprints, physical descriptions, eyewitness accounts, traditional laboratory testing, and investigative interviews. Those tools could solve murders, but they could not always identify a carefully concealed offender. Diane's case became one of those investigations. The evidence was preserved, but the identity of the person who left biological material behind remained hidden. As the decades passed, the case became increasingly difficult to investigate through traditional methods. Witnesses moved away. Memories changed. Some people involved in the original investigation eventually died. The world around the crime scene changed. Even Diane's daughter grew from a 4-year-old child into an adult while the case remained unresolved. But one thing did not change. The evidence connected to the murder remained part of the investigative record. That evidence would eventually become the most important bridge to the future. The person at the end of that bridge was Richard Cottingham. By the time investigators focused on him, he was no longer an unknown young man. He had become a convicted serial killer serving a life sentence in New Jersey. His criminal history was already associated with several murders, and investigators had spent decades trying to determine whether his known crimes represented the full extent of his violence. The possibility that he had killed Diane existed because the timeline was plausible. But investigators needed something stronger than possibility. They needed evidence connecting him to her. That is why the DNA result mattered so much. In 2021, Nassau County investigators revisited evidence from Diane's case and submitted it for modern forensic testing. According to the Nassau County District Attorney's Office, the Division of Forensic Sciences at the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner tested the evidence and generated a DNA profile in early 2022. The profile matched Cottingham, NASADA.org. That result changed the investigation instantly. The old case file now contained something investigators in 1968 could never have obtained: a genetic link to a known person. The discovery did not erase the decades that had passed. Instead, it made those decades part of the evidence store. The case showed how an investigation can evolve across generations. The original detectives gathered the physical evidence. Later, investigators preserved and reviewed it. Modern forensic scientists extracted information from it. Prosecutors then used that information to build a legal case. The investigation became a chain stretching from one generation to another. But the case also raised an important question. Why had the killer remained unidentified for so long if the evidence existed? The answer lies partly in the nature of forensic science. Evidence is only as useful as the technology available to interpret it. A fingerprint could be compared in 1968. A blood type could sometimes exclude a suspect. Trace evidence could provide clues. But none of those methods could produce the kind of individual genetic identification that became possible later. A biological sample could sit in storage for years without revealing a name. Then technology could advance enough to transform it. This is why the preservation of evidence is so critical in cold case investigations. Investigators do not always know what future science will be able to do. They cannot predict which technology will exist 20, 30, or 50 years later. They can only preserve what may someday become important. Diane's case proved the value of that approach. The evidence survived long enough to be re-examined, and when it was, the result was powerful enough to change the case's entire trajectory. Cottingham was charged with Diane's murder in June 2022. At 75 years old, he appeared virtually from prison. He pleaded not guilty. For prosecutors, the case now had to move from forensic investigation to legal proof. The evidence would need to be presented according to courtroom standards. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's claim. The passage of time could become both an obstacle and an argument, but the central forensic connection remained. The biological evidence pointed to Cottingham, and the more investigators examined the historical record, the more significant that result became. Cottingham's known criminal history was already disturbing. He had been convicted of multiple murders in New York and New Jersey. His crimes had involved sexual violence, strangulation, and mutilation. His later notoriety had earned him the nickname Torso Killer, yet the Diane Cusick case represented a much earlier point in time. If he had killed Diane, then his known series of murders began earlier than many people had understood. That possibility was not merely academic. It meant investigators could look at other unsolved cases from the late 1960s and early 1970s through a different lens. The danger was obvious. Investigators could not assume that every unsolved murder belonged to Cottingham, but his identification could provide a new starting point for examining cases that had previously lacked suspects. This is one of the ways cold case breakthroughs can create investigative ripples. Solving one murder can reopen questions about others. A DNA match can provide a suspect's identity. A suspect's known history can then become a guide for reviewing other unsolved crimes. In Cottingham's case, that process eventually produced additional admission. When he pleaded guilty to Diane's murder in December 2022, he also admitted killing 4 other Long Island women: Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. Nasada.org. Their cases had also remained unresolved for decades. The admissions meant that 5 Long Island families received information that had been unavailable for generations. But Diane's case remained unique because it represented the earliest of the 5 killings. Her murder occurred in 1968, years before the 4 other confirmed Long Island cases. The chronology suggested that Cottingham's violence may have begun earlier than previously established. It also demonstrated the importance of revisiting old cases even when the original investigation had produced no suspect. A cold case can remain dormant without being dead. The file can wait. The evidence can wait. The science can wait. And sometimes the suspect can remain alive long enough for modern investigators to find him. Cottingham was already incarcerated when the Diane investigation reached its breakthrough. Investigators did not need to find him on the street. They needed to establish the connection between him and the evidence. His DNA profile gave them that opportunity. That fact made Diane's case unusual. The killer had not disappeared completely. He had been caught for other crimes years earlier, yet the family still had no answer because no one had connected him to Diane. It took modern forensic analysis to make that connection. The eventual guilty plea provided the legal confirmation that the family had waited for. On December 5th, SILD 2022, Cottingham pleaded guilty to killing Diane and was sentenced to 25 years to life. He also admitted the 4 additional Long Island murders. Nasada.org. The courtroom moment closed one chapter, but the emotional story had been unfolding since 1968. Diane's daughter had lived almost her entire life without her mother. She had never had the chance to experience the relationship that should have continued through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. The guilty plea could not restore that time, but it could answer the question that had shaped the family's life for decades. Who killed Diane? The answer was now official. Richard Cottingham. The case had moved through every stage of uncertainty. First, there was a murder without a suspect. Then there was a cold case without a solution. Then there was a forensic breakthrough. Then an indictment. Then a guilty plea. The progression demonstrated something fundamental about criminal investigations. A case does not necessarily become weaker simply because it becomes old. Sometimes the passage of time gives science an opportunity to become stronger. The investigators of 1968 could not imagine what forensic laboratories would be able to accomplish decades later. They preserved evidence because it was part of the investigation. That preservation created the possibility of a future breakthrough. When the future arrived, the evidence was still there. The name Diane Cusick could finally be connected to a perpetrator, and the case that had once seemed destined to remain an unanswered mystery became one of the most striking examples of a cold case solved through modern DNA technology. But beneath the science and courtroom proceedings remained the human reality. Diane had been 23. She had a 4-year-old daughter. She had a profession. She had a family waiting for her. She had gone to buy dance shoes. Her life should have continued. Instead, it ended in the parking lot of a shopping mall. 54 years later, the person responsible admitted what he had done. That is the point at which a cold case stops being only a police investigation and becomes a permanent part of a family's history. The evidence solved the case. The DNA supplied the connection. The guilty plea supplied the admission, but nothing could change the fact that Diane's daughter had spent a lifetime without her mother. The finality of the legal outcome could never equal the finality of the loss. What it could provide was something different: certainty. For decades, the family had lived with unanswered questions. Now there was an answer, and that answer had survived for more than 50 years inside evidence collected from a crime scene that investigators once feared might never reveal the killer's identity. By the time Richard Cottingham stood before a Nassau County court and admitted responsibility for Diane Cusick's murder, more than half a century had passed since the night her parents found her body inside her car at Green Acres Mall. The guilty plea was dramatic. The headlines were immediate. A 54-year-old cold case had been solved. DNA evidence had identified the killer. One of America's most notorious serial murderers had confessed. Yet beneath those headlines was a reality that often receives less attention. For Diane's family, justice had arrived in a world that no longer resembled the one that existed when she died. The years between 1968 and 2022 were not empty. They were filled with birthdays, holidays, graduations, marriages, illnesses, losses, and ordinary days that Diane never experienced. Her daughter grew up without her. Her parents aged without answer. Entire generations passed while the investigation remained unresolved. The guilty plea answered the central question of who killed Diane, but it could not return the decades that had already disappeared. That passage of time is what makes cold cases uniquely haunting. In many homicide investigations, the criminal justice process begins almost immediately after a suspect is identified. Witnesses remember details. Physical evidence is fresh. The crime scene still exists in its original form. Prosecutors build their cases close to the moment of the crime. In Diane's case, the investigation stretched across more than half a century. The people who first worked the case had long since retired. Some had died. Witnesses had aged. The physical landscape surrounding Green Acres Mall had changed dramatically, yet the evidence remained, locked away in storage, preserved through years when no one could have known exactly how valuable it would become. The survival of that evidence is one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation. Cold case detectives often describe preserved evidence as a message from the past. It contains information that investigators may not yet understand. A biological sample collected in one decade can become the key to solving a crime in another. The original detectives who examined Diane's case could not perform modern DNA analysis. The technology did not exist. They could only collect and preserve what they believed might matter. Their decision to do so became one of the most important choices in the entire investigation. Without preserved evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there would have been no match to Cottingham. Without the match, the case might still be unsolved today. For forensic investigators, Diane's murder became an example of why cold case evidence must be protected even when a case appears impossible to solve. Scientific progress does not happen all at once. It arrives gradually. Every decade introduces new techniques, new databases, and new methods of interpretation. Evidence that appears useless in one era may become decisive in another. The biological material connected to Diane's murder survived long enough to benefit from that progress. In effect, the evidence waited for science to catch up. The investigation also highlighted the importance of DNA databases in modern criminal justice. According to authorities, the profile developed from evidence in Diane's case was compared against Cottingham's known DNA profile, creating the connection that ultimately led to charges. That process reflects one of the most powerful developments in forensic science. A suspect no longer needs to be identified through eyewitness testimony alone. Biological evidence can create a connection independently. In some cases, it can even reveal suspects whom investigators never considered. In Diane's case, the DNA did not merely support an existing theory, it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Yet the science tells only part of the story. The emotional impact of the case cannot be measured through laboratory reports or court records. Diane's daughter, Darlene, spent most of her life knowing only that her mother had been murdered. The person responsible remained unknown. There was no face attached to the crime, no legal conclusion, no definitive explanation. Every passing year made the possibility of an answer seem more distant. Then, suddenly, the impossible happened. The evidence spoke. Investigators identified a suspect. Charges were filed. A courtroom hearing followed, and eventually, a guilty plea transformed decades of uncertainty into certainty. That transition from uncertainty to certainty is one of the defining moments in any cold case investigation. Uncertainty creates endless possibilities. People wonder what happened. They imagine different scenarios. Rumors develop. Theories spread. Families replay events repeatedly, searching for details that might explain the tragedy. Certainty ends that process. It may not ease the pain, but it replaces speculation with fact. In Diane's case, the guilty plea established a legal reality. Richard Cottingham admitted responsibility. The question that had haunted the investigation for 54 years finally had an answer. But the answer also connected Diane's case to a larger history of violence. Cottingham was not simply another convicted murderer. He was one of the most notorious serial killers associated with the New York and New Jersey region. His criminal history included multiple murders and decades of investigation. The admission in Diane's case expanded the public understanding of that history. It suggested that his known pattern of violence reached back further than many people had previously realized. Diane was not simply another victim connected to a famous offender. She represented an earlier chapter in a story that investigators spent decades trying to understand. The relationship between serial offenders and cold cases has always been complex. A serial offender may commit crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Different police agencies may investigate separate cases without realizing they are connected. Evidence may remain isolated inside different case files. Years can pass before patterns emerge. In some situations, the offender is arrested for one crime while other victims remain unidentified. That reality is one reason why cold case investigations continue even after a serial killer has been convicted. Investigators know that a conviction does not necessarily reveal every victim. Diane's case illustrated this challenge perfectly. Cottingham had already been imprisoned for years before the DNA evidence connected him to her murder. He was not hiding from investigators. He was already known to law enforcement. Yet Diane's case remained unsolved because no one had established the forensic connection. The killer was in prison. The victim had been identified since 1968. The missing piece was the evidence linking them together. Once that link was established, the investigation moved rapidly. The speed of that final phase contrasts sharply with the decades that preceded it. The murder occurred in 1968. The DNA breakthrough emerged in 2021 and 2022. Charges followed. Then came the guilty plea. More than 50 years of uncertainty were followed by a relatively brief period of legal resolution. This pattern is common in cold case investigations. The breakthrough often arrives suddenly, even though it is built upon decades of preserved evidence and investigative work. For many observers, the case also raised broader questions about justice and time. What does justice mean when it arrives after 54 years? Can a guilty plea truly resolve a loss that has shaped an entire lifetime? These questions do not have simple answers. The criminal justice system can identify a perpetrator and impose a sentence. It can establish legal responsibility, but it cannot restore lost years. It cannot replace a mother. It cannot erase grief. The purpose of justice in a cold case is therefore different from restoration. Restoration is impossible. Accountability is not. The courtroom proceedings reflected that reality. Cottingham was already serving life sentences for other crimes. The additional sentence imposed in Diane's case did not dramatically change the practical reality of his imprisonment. He was never going to be released. Yet the sentence still mattered. It mattered because Diane's murder deserved recognition as a crime with its own victim, its own evidence, and its own legal conclusion. The guilty plea ensured that Diane's case would not simply be absorbed into the broader history of Cottingham's violence. Her name would stand on its own. That distinction is important because cold cases often risk reducing victims to investigative puzzles. The public focuses on suspects, evidence, and forensic breakthroughs. But behind every case is a human life interrupted. Diane was not defined by the manner of her death. She was a daughter, a mother, a dance instructor, and a young woman with plans for the future. The investigation existed because her life mattered. The evidence mattered because she mattered, and the eventual breakthrough mattered because her family deserved answers. As investigators reviewed Diane's case, they were not only solving a mystery, they were restoring a measure of historical truth. The official record could finally reflect what happened. Future generations would not encounter Diane's name as part of an unsolved homicide. They would encounter it as part of a solved case that demonstrated the power of forensic science and persistence. The transformation of her case from mystery to resolution became a lesson for investigators across the country. Cold case units often operate with limited resources. They examine evidence collected decades earlier and revisit investigations that many people assume are impossible to solve. Success requires patience. It requires meticulous review of records, evidence, and witness statements. Most importantly, it requires the belief that old cases still matter. Diane's investigation validated that belief. More than 50 years after her murder, a combination of preserved evidence, modern science, and determined investigators produced an answer. Yet even with that answer, the emotional center of the story remains unchanged. A young mother went shopping and never came home. A 4-year-old daughter lost her mother. A family spent decades waiting. The scientific breakthrough, the DNA match, the indictment, and the guilty plea all emerged from that original tragedy. They are chapters in the investigation, but they are not the beginning of the story. The beginning remains a winter evening in 1968 and a family searching a parking lot for someone they love. The extraordinary thing is that the search never truly ended. Investigators continued examining evidence. Families continued asking questions. Prosecutors continued supporting cold case review. For more than 50 years, the possibility of an answer survived. Eventually, that possibility became reality. The evidence connected Diane to Richard Cottingham. The court recorded his admission, and a case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally reached a conclusion. But the conclusion carried a message extending far beyond one investigation. It demonstrated that time can delay justice, but it does not always defeat it. Sometimes evidence survives. Sometimes science advances. Sometimes a case file forgotten by the public becomes active again. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth finally emerges from the shadows where it has been waiting all along. The guilty plea answered the central question in Diane Cusick's murder, but it also forced investigators, prosecutors, and the public to look backward at a period of violence that had remained hidden for years. Richard Cottingham had not appeared suddenly in 2022. His criminal history had developed decades earlier, and Diane's murder now stood at the beginning of a timeline that would eventually include multiple killings across New York and New Jersey. That chronology matters because cold cases are often not isolated mysteries. They can be fragments of a larger story separated by years and buried under different investigations. Diane's case was one of those fragments. For more than 50 years, it appeared to be a single, unsolved murder. After the DNA breakthrough and Cottingham's guilty plea, investigators could finally see it as part of a broader pattern of violence. Yet the most important fact remained that Diane was a person before she became part of that pattern. She was 23 years old. She was a mother. She worked as a dance instructor. She had a 4-year-old daughter. Her family knew her as Diane, not as victim number one. On February 15th, 1968, she went to Green Acres Mall to buy dancing shoes. That ordinary purpose would become the final known chapter of her life. By approximately 10:30 that night, her parents were searching for her. They found her car in the mall parking lot. Diane was inside. She had been beaten and strangled. Her hands had been bound, and adhesive tape had been used around her mouth and neck. Her death was violent, but the identity of the person responsible remained hidden. The original investigation could establish what had happened to Diane. It could not establish who had done it. That distinction is what turned the case into a cold case. Years passed. Investigators continued to examine the available information, but no suspect was successfully identified. The case remained in the files. Then the wider criminal history of Richard Cottingham began to emerge. His arrest in 1980 eventually led investigators to multiple murders and other violent offenses. He became known as the Torso Killer, and his convictions established him as a serial murderer. But his known crimes did not automatically solve Diane's murder. There had to be evidence. Decades later, that evidence finally became available in a form that could be tested. The old biological material associated with Diane's murder was preserved. In 2021, Nassau County investigators revisited it. The Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner's Division of Forensic Sciences conducted testing, and in early 2022, investigators generated a DNA profile. Authorities said the profile matched Cottingham. Nasada.org. Suddenly, the chronology had a forensic angle. Cottingham was not merely a person whose later crimes made him interesting to investigators. His DNA was connected to evidence from Diane's murder. That connection gave prosecutors a foundation for charging him. In June 2022, he was indicted for second-degree murder. He appeared virtually from prison and initially pleaded not guilty. The legal process was beginning more than 5 decades after the crime itself. The age of the case created unusual circumstances. Many of the people who might once have testified about Diane were no longer alive. Others were elderly. Memories from 1968 could not be expected to remain unchanged. Physical locations had changed. Investigative methods had changed. But the evidence remained. That is what made the case so extraordinary. A cold case often depends on something that can resist time. In Diane's case, that something was biological evidence. DNA can be remarkably powerful because it can provide a connection independent of human memory. A witness may forget. A document may be lost. A person may move, but a properly preserved biological sample can remain capable of analysis for decades. When the technology becomes available, investigators can return to the evidence and ask new questions. That process does not require rewriting the original investigation. It adds a new layer of scientific information. Diane's case demonstrates the difference between an investigation that has failed and an investigation that has reached the limits of its technology. In 1968, investigators may have done everything they could with the tools available. The case remained unsolved, not because the victim was forgotten, but because the perpetrator could not be identified. Decades later, modern forensic testing moved beyond those limitations. The case could finally progress. The DNA result also had implications beyond Diane. Cottingham was already known as a serial killer, and investigators had reason to believe his criminal history might include more victims than those for which he had been convicted. When he pleaded guilty to Diane's murder in December 2022, he also admitted responsibility for 4 additional Long Island murders. The four women were Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. Their deaths occurred between 1972 and 1973. Nasada.org. The admissions created a grim sequence. Diane in 1968, Hines in 1972, Moy in 1972, Hyman in 1973, Rosado Nieves in 1973, 5 women over approximately 5 years. Each murder had once existed as an individual mystery. Now they were connected through one offender's admissions and the broader investigation into Cottingham. The families of those women had spent decades living with uncertainty. Some had waited more than 50 years for information about what happened to their loved one. The admissions could not undo the crimes, but they could answer questions that had remained open for generations. The case of Mary Beth Hines was particularly disturbing in its own right. Hines was 21 years old when her body was discovered in Rockville Center in May 1972. She had been found face down in a muddy stream in a wooded area. She had been strangled. She had grown up in Mineola and was working as a mother's helper in Belmore. Her death had remained unresolved until Cottingham admitted responsibility. Laverne Moy was 23 and a mother of 2. Her body was found in July 1972 in the same general area. She had also been strangled. Sheila Hyman was 33, a mother of 3, when she was killed inside her home in North Woodmere in July 1973. Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves was 18 when she was killed later that year and found near Jones Beach. She had also been strangled. Nasada.org. These cases demonstrate why identifying a serial offender can have consequences far beyond one prosecution. When a killer is connected to another murder, investigators can potentially provide answers to another family. A single forensic breakthrough can create a chain reaction. One DNA match can reopen multiple cases. One suspect can become the key to understanding years of unexplained violence, but the process must remain evidence-based. Investigators cannot simply attribute every similar case to the same offender. Each case requires its own proof, its own evidence, and its own legal conclusion. Diane's case had that proof through the DNA evidence and Cottingham's subsequent guilty plea. The other admissions provided additional information about his criminal history, but the legal circumstances surrounding each case were different. This distinction is particularly important when discussing serial murder investigations. The public often wants a complete answer immediately. If an offender is known to have killed several people, there is a natural temptation to connect every unsolved murder occurring in the same region and period. Investigators must resist that temptation. A cold case is solved when the evidence supports a conclusion, not when a theory sounds convincing. Diane's case is powerful precisely because the evidence solely on the reputation of the accused. The DNA connected him to the evidence. His guilty plea later confirmed responsibility. The scientific result came first. The legal admission came afterward. Together, they provided a strong conclusion. The case also illustrates why the passage of time does not necessarily make forensic evidence irrelevant. In fact, sometimes the opposite is true. An old sample can become more valuable as technology improves. A biological trace that could not be identified in 1968 may become highly informative decades later. This is one reason law enforcement agencies continue to revisit unsolved cases. A case file may contain evidence that investigators could not fully exploit when it was first collected. New laboratories may be able to test it. New databases may provide a comparison that did not exist before. New investigators may recognize connections that earlier generations could not see. The Diane Cusick investigation followed exactly that pattern. The case began with traditional police work. It remained unresolved for decades. Then, a modern forensic approach changed its trajectory. In many ways, the story is a reminder that evidence has no expiration date simply because an investigation has gone cold. The physical evidence from Diane's murder did not become less important because 50 years passed. Its potential remained dormant. When investigators returned to it, they were able to use a technology that had transformed criminal investigations around the world. The result was a name, Richard Cottingham. Then came the indictment, then the guilty plea, then the sentence. On December 5th, SIL 2022, Cottingham was sentenced to 25 years to life for Diane's murder. Nasada.org. The sentence was legally significant, but emotionally complicated. Cottingham was already serving life sentences for other murders. The additional sentence would not fundamentally change his physical circumstances, but it changed the historical record of Diane's death. Her murder now had a defendant who had admitted responsibility. Her family could finally say who killed her. That certainty matters even when punishment cannot restore the victim. It matters because an unsolved murder leaves families trapped between grief and uncertainty. The victim is gone, but the story is incomplete. Every unanswered question can become a permanent burden. When the offender is identified and admits responsibility, one part of that burden can finally be lifted. For Diane's daughter, the answer came after almost her entire life had passed. She had been a small child when her mother died. By the time the case was solved, she had spent decades carrying the consequences of a crime she was too young to understand when it happened. The guilty plea could not give her back the childhood she should have had, but it could remove one terrible uncertainty. Her mother's killer had finally been named. The story of Diane Cusick therefore became more than a story about a serial killer. It became a story about evidence surviving time. It became a story about how forensic science can reach backward across generations, and it became a story about the difference between an unresolved case and a forgotten case. Diane's case was never forgotten. Her family remembered her. Investigators preserved the evidence. The file remained available. The science advanced. Eventually, those elements came together. The result was not a dramatic discovery at a remote crime scene or a confession whispered to a detective after decades. It was a laboratory result produced from evidence collected long before DNA had become part of everyday criminal investigation. The technology changed the question from who could have done this to whose DNA is here, and the answer pointed to a man whose criminal history had already established him as a killer. That answer eventually became a guilty plea. The case had traveled from a mall parking lot in 1968 to a courtroom in 2022. Between those two moments lay 54 years of waiting. 54 years in which Diane's daughter grew up. 54 years in which investigators changed. 54 years in which forensic science evolved. 54 years in which the evidence remained silent. Then the evidence spoke. And what it revealed was devastating but definitive. The young woman who went to Green Acres Mall for dance shoes had been killed by Richard Cottingham. Her case was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was a documented murder with a documented perpetrator. And for a family that had spent generations waiting for that answer, the most important thing was not the sensational nickname attached to the killer or the extraordinary technology that exposed him. It was Diane's name. After all those years, her story could finally be told with the ending that had been missing since 1968. For more than half a century, Diane Cusick's murder existed in a strange space between memory and evidence. The crime had been documented. The victim had been identified. The circumstances of her death were known, but the person responsible remained outside the reach of investigators. That changed only when modern forensic science returned to evidence collected in 1968 and produced a result that detectives of that era could never have imagined. The name Richard Cottingham transformed the case, but it also forced investigators to confront a difficult reality. The solution to Diane's murder had been waiting inside an old investigation for decades. The case had not been empty. It had been incomplete. Diane's family had always known that she had been killed. They had never known who killed her. Those two facts can coexist for decades in a cold case. A family can have certainty about the tragedy while having no certainty about the person responsible. That was the reality Diane's daughter inherited as a child. She knew her mother was gone. She eventually understood that she had been murdered, but the identity of the killer remained unknown throughout her childhood, adolescence, and much of her adult life. The unanswered question became part of the family's permanent landscape. Then the DNA breakthrough arrived. According to Nassau County authorities, evidence connected to the 1968 murder was retested in 2021. The Division of Forensic Sciences at the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner generated a DNA profile in early 2022, and investigators said the profile matched Richard Cottingham. Nasada.org fascinate.org. It was the kind of discovery that can make an old case feel suddenly new. Detectives were now examining the same murder, but they were doing so with information unavailable to the original investigators. The evidence had not changed. The science had. That difference is at the heart of many successful cold case investigations. A case may remain unsolved because investigators reach the limits of what the available technology can reveal. When technology advances, those limits move. Suddenly, evidence that once provided only a general clue can become highly specific. DNA is particularly powerful in this regard because it can establish an association between biological material and an individual. In Diane's case, that association became the foundation of a homicide prosecution, but the breakthrough did not erase the complexity of the investigation. More than 50 years had passed. The crime scene was long gone in its original form. The shopping mall and surrounding environment had changed. People who remembered 1968 had aged. Some witnesses might no longer be alive. Memories that had once been fresh were now separated from the crime by generation. Investigators therefore had to rely heavily on preserved physical evidence and historical records. This is one of the reasons cold cases are so difficult. Time does not simply create distance. It removes investigative opportunities. A witness who could have answered a question in 1968 might be unreachable decades later. A suspect may die. Documents can disappear. Physical locations can change beyond recognition. Even investigators can no longer be questioned because the people who worked the original case may have retired or passed away. Yet Diane's case retained something that time could not completely erase: biological evidence. That evidence became the thread connecting the original crime to the modern investigation. When investigators compared the DNA profile with Cottingham's profile, the thread became a direct link. Cottingham's identity was already known. His criminal record was already extensive. He was already imprisoned for other murders. That meant investigators did not need to search blindly for an unknown offender. They had a specific person to investigate. The legal process followed. In June 2022, Cottingham was charged with second-degree murder in Diane's death. He appeared virtually before a Nassau County judge from prison and initially pleaded not guilty. The case had officially moved from investigation to prosecution. For Diane's family, this was a remarkable moment. The man accused of killing her mother had finally been identified more than 5 decades after the crime, but the case still needed to reach its legal conclusion. An indictment is an accusation, not a conviction. The prosecution had to proceed according to law. Then, only months later, the case changed dramatically. On December 5th, still 2022, Cottingham pleaded guilty to killing Diane. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. During the same proceeding, he admitted responsibility for 4 additional Long Island murders. Nassauda.org. The guilty plea removed the uncertainty surrounding the prosecution. Cottingham was no longer merely the suspect identified through DNA. He was the man who admitted responsibility in court. The legal record now contained the answer that Diane's family had been waiting for since 1968. But the plea also made the broader story impossible to ignore. Cottingham had been associated with multiple murders over a period of years. The 4 additional Long Island victims were Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. Their murders occurred between 1972 and 1973. The fact that Cottingham admitted those killings at the same time as Diane's murder transformed the hearing into something much larger than a single-case proceeding. 5 families were receiving answers to questions that had endured for decades. 5 victims were being named in connection with one offender, and the earliest case among them was Diane's. That chronology suggested that her murder belonged to an earlier period of Cottingham's criminal activity than some of his better-known crimes. For investigators studying serial murder, chronology can be crucial. Patterns emerge through time. Offenders may change methods. Their behavior may evolve. Their geographic range may shift. But the earliest known crime can reveal something important about how the offender's activities began. Diane's murder, therefore, had significance beyond its own investigation. It extended the documented timeline of Cottingham's violence backward to 1968. Still, The case must be handled carefully. A serial offender's reputation cannot be used as proof for every unsolved crime. Investigators need specific evidence connecting an offender to each victim. Diane's case provided such evidence through DNA and the subsequent guilty plea. The other murders were connected through Cottingham's admission. That distinction separates documented facts from speculation. It also explains why the DNA breakthrough was so important. The investigators did not identify Cottingham simply because he was already a convicted killer. They identified him because the forensic evidence connected him to Diane's murder. The scientific finding then led to the legal proceedings and eventual admission. The process illustrates a basic principle of criminal investigation. Suspicion can reopen a case, but evidence must carry it forward. The evidence from Diane's case had survived long enough to do exactly that. The story also illustrates the extraordinary role of forensic preservation. In 1968, investigators could not have predicted the future of DNA science. They did not know that genetic profiling would eventually become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. They could not know that a sample collected during Diane's autopsy or crime scene examination might still be capable of producing a profile more than 5 decades later. They could only preserve the evidence because it was relevant to the investigation. That decision created an opportunity for future investigators. When the evidence was retested in 2021, the laboratory could use methods unavailable in the original investigation. The resulting profile became the critical clue. This is why cold case units often return to old evidence. The objective is not necessarily to discover something that investigators overlook. Sometimes it is to apply modern science to evidence that was already known. The difference can be extraordinary. A sample that once produced no identification may now produce a complete genetic profile. A profile that once had no comparison may now match a database record. A database record can lead to an identified suspect, and an identified suspect can finally face the victim's family in court. Diane's case followed this chain almost perfectly. Evidence was preserved. Science advanced. A profile was generated. A match was found. A suspect was charged. A guilty plea followed. More than 50 years of uncertainty collapsed into a matter of months. Yet the emotional consequences remained much more complicated. Diane's daughter had spent decades living with the absence of her mother. The legal system could provide certainty about the killer, but it could not restore the relationship that had been stolen. It could not return the years Diane missed. It could not give her daughter memories that had never been made. That is the painful distinction between justice and restoration. Justice can identify responsibility. It can impose punishment. It can create an official record, but it cannot reverse time. Diane was still 23 when she died. Her daughter was still 4. Those facts never changed. Everything else did. The daughter grew older. The killer grew older. The investigators changed. Technology changed. The case moved through generations. Diane remained forever the age she was when her life ended. Her daughter, however, continued living with the unanswered question. When the answer finally arrived, it came after a lifetime of waiting. This is why cold case breakthroughs can be emotionally overwhelming, even when the victim's family has known for years that the case might never be solved. Hope can survive quietly without becoming expectation. Families may learn to live without answers because they have no choice. They may stop expecting a phone call from investigators. They may assume the killer will never be found. Then, one day, the phone rings. A detective has news. A laboratory has produced a result. A name has been identified. A case that had been silent for decades suddenly becomes active again. Diane's family experienced that transformation after more than 50 years. The breakthrough was not merely scientific. It was personal. The name Richard Cottingham became attached to a crime that had shaped the family's life since 1968. The guilty plea then removed the final uncertainty. Cottingham admitted killing Diane. The court sentenced him to 25 years to life. Nasada.org. There was no dramatic chase, no final confrontation in the street, no killer fleeing from police. The breakthrough came quietly, inside forensic evidence. The decisive moment was not necessarily visible to the public. Somewhere inside a laboratory, an old piece of evidence was transformed into a genetic profile. That profile was compared with Cottingham's DNA. The match created the connection, and that connection eventually brought the case into court. In many ways, this is the modern face of cold case investigation. The most important evidence may not look dramatic. It may be a microscopic biological trace. It may sit inside an evidence package for years. It may appear insignificant to someone without specialized training. But when technology catches up, that trace can become more powerful than decades of speculation. Diane's case demonstrates exactly that. Her killer was not discovered because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail. He was identified because science could finally interpret evidence collected more than 50 years earlier. And once the evidence produced a name, the legal system could finally act. The story of Diane Cusick therefore became a warning and a promise at the same time. A warning that an ordinary evening can end in unimaginable violence, a promise that evidence can survive longer than investigators expect, a promise that a case can remain open in ways that are invisible to the public. The file may sit quietly, but the investigation is never necessarily over. Diane's case remained alive because the evidence remained. In 2022, that evidence finally led to Richard Cottingham. The answer came late. It came after 54 years. It came after Diane's daughter had spent almost her entire life without her mother. But it came. And in the end, that single fact changed the story forever. The murder that had once been remembered only as an unsolved tragedy could finally be remembered as a case that science solved. A prosecutor brought to court, and a killer admitted in his own words. Diane's name no longer stood beside a question mark. It stood beside an answer. The most haunting element of Diane Cusick's story was not simply that her killer remained unidentified for 54 years. It was that the evidence capable of identifying him had survived almost the entire span of a human lifetime. In 1968, investigators could document the crime, preserve physical material, interview witnesses, and search for suspects, but they did not possess the forensic technology that would eventually make the decisive identification possible. More than 5 decades later, investigators returned to that evidence and obtained what the original detectives could never have imagined: a DNA profile that pointed directly to Richard Cottingham. The breakthrough changed everything, but it also demonstrated why the oldest cases can sometimes